I thought we could talk a bit about AVs. There are two stories that initially I'd had as separate, but I think they dovetail together in interesting ways. So the first is Tesla and their earnings ouch, where basically, they had a fairly big miss on earnings, and they spent a lot of time in that earnings call pointing to the future, the new lower cost EV, but also a lot of discussion about autonomous vehicles and robotaxis and how that is going to be, in a sense, the savior. It's going to add a huge amount of value to Tesla and to the owners of those vehicles and so on. And that's going to increase the value of the company. And actually, the share price popped after the announcement. So that was one story. And then the other story I saw was that Ford, which has a hands-free driver assistance, so actually I think more advanced than Tesla's FSD, because you didn't have to have your hands on the steering wheel. And there were a number of crashes, and there was an investigation and said, oh, well, the investigation found that this hands-free driver assistance was responsible or implicated in a number of these crashes. And I think there's an investigation and it's been suspended and so on. And so I think the through line I wanted to draw here is in terms of AV safety, right? In order for autonomous vehicles to be accepted, do we need them to be as safe as human drivers, or do we need them to be way, way safer? And if it's the latter, what are the implications of that for Tesla and their ambitions?
I don't know how you are going to make something safe enough that a mother with a child is going to feel comfortable handing over control. I don't know how you create that feeling. And maybe it's a generational thing. So maybe you have to start with someone taking over parking, which we have at the moment. I think we've all lost the skill of parking generally, which is great because I didn't have it to begin with. And then you take over other trickier maneuvers potentially. And maybe over time we creep towards full autonomous, fully controlled by someone else. But whenever you get into a situation where two cars are going to potentially hit each other and they are connected to each other in the name of prevention, and there's a decision point there, you need to be able to trust that the thing is going to look after you. And I don't know how anyone's ever going to have that trust, particularly with all the narrative around the doomerist culture and things like that. How do we create that trust in something that you'll be willing to put your family in the car?
I guess, I've fought this autonomous car battle starting in 2014. So I've been in this for 10 years. And the biggest sort of disagreement between Travis and I and Uber was like the timeline for these things. Part the technology. Everyone's like, oh my God, Moore's Law, this thing is going to be ready in, 2019. And it's so much more complex than Moore's Law. The technology timelines are separate. I actually bet that today per mile, the autonomous vehicles from Cruise and Tesla are probably safer per mile. But the second thing I disagreed with on timelines is no one wants to be in an accident with a computer. It's just too weird. So it's going to have to be safer before people say, you know what, we want this on our roads and with our kids and all that. But I do think it'll happen because I remember people say, I'll never get in a car with a stranger for Uber. Like, how it's unsafe. Like, what the hell? The drunk driving deaths in cities where Uber is dominant have plummeted big time. The need for parking at airports plummeted big time. Lots of good outcomes. Yes, there's some accidents when an Uber driver gets in an accident. It's a big deal because it's an Uber driver. But net, the safety results are clear. So maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, but it's going to happen. I have a daughter who's 4 years old. I don't know if she'll ever drive, and I'd probably be comfortable with that.
For me, I didn't pass my driving test until I was in my mid-30s. And that was because I lived in cities my entire life. I was really used to public transport. I was used to just getting my own way around. And so learning to drive much later gave me this sense of I never felt this was something I was going to accomplish. It's a tricky skill. And at this point, we feel I can have some empathy with someone who says, oh, it doesn't know how to fold laundry. How's it going to know how to drive a car? And because they're seeing them all as the same thing. And they're not the same thing. They're completely different devices, modalities, representations of things, but everyone has kind of brought them in together as the same thing when they're not. So if we can find ways to make all the other interactions that you have with decision making around AI and so on feel as safe as possible, then that can only be a rising tide that's going to help the autonomous vehicle anyway.
I spoke to a friend of mine who works at Waymo who basically said, yes, internally their feeling is they have to be a lot safer than people. But Emil, you mentioned Uber, and I nearly wonder if what the sector needs is kind of a Travis sort of a person who doesn't give a shit to a certain extent, right? Who's willing to be a bit brazen and say, we have data to show that our things are safer. And yes, they're going to crash sometimes. Yes, people are going to get killed. Yes, that's a tragedy, but that's happening on our roads every day. And so the fact that that happens isn't a reason to stop these things from getting out there. If statistically they're safer, then we should be using them. And someone who's willing to kind of take the heat and just stand up when it happens, and instead of making sort of mealy-mouthed statements about how it's terrible and we're going to like suspend the program until we see what happened or whatever, it just is like, yep, you know, this is an unavoidable part of what it means to be driving on the roads, and we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Like, if Waymo had the guts to do that under Alphabet, would they be able to bring the regulators along with them ultimately through a bit of a game of regulatory chicken in the way that Uber often did it? Is this really about a lack of courage and a lack of will rather than people's sort of fundamental feelings of, I wouldn't trust, you know, a robot to drive this thing? Because, like, you know, we get into planes every day, and first of all, we're not flying them, the pilot's flying them, but actually, most of the time the pilot's not flying them, the autopilot's flying them, and no one really seems to have a problem with that. So I wonder if this is actually about a lack of courage from the companies involved in this game.
I don't know, man. Elon's out there. He's pretty courageous. So I think, like, you know, when the Cruise car had that accident in San Francisco, if you recall, a couple months ago, and there was a big debate as to whether it was the Cruise that messed up or another car hit a pedestrian that then ended up under a Cruise. California suspended the program. Cruise also did, because they were a little, you know, and they fired all the execs and they did all the things we're talking about. But I just think the public will have to feel that, and you do need someone to be in the bully pulpit saying that. But I think Elon's pretty much leading the charge on this stuff right now. Ford wouldn't do it, you know, Waymo, whatever. But maybe you're right. Maybe there's some extra years you can get by someone sort of being on the bully pulpit, talking about the benefits loudly and pushing forward in a harder way.
Well, what's the expectation that we think is going to be acceptable? Is it 0? No deaths ever?
We'll never get to 0.
Yeah, of course we can't get to 0. And then we're always going to be waiting for it to go wrong, which is not a helpful piece. So if we can get to a point where there's this education, there's comfort just through generations. To your point, Emil, you have a child who, if she never drives, that's great. Like, as you say, she's probably safer in an AV than she is with any human driver. You know, if you said we all know that the pilot's not flying the plane, but I don't know if we all do know that. I think there's still this understanding coming through of just how little the pilot really does.
Emil, I wanted to ask you about the Uber days because I feel like the analogy is fairly close, and maybe I'm missing something. But, you know, you said that when the Cruise crash happened, California suspended the program. And I'm like, did not Uber in the early-ish days with UberX constantly operate in jurisdictions where it was not technically allowed to operate, paid the fines of the drivers, and just kind of, again, played a game of chicken with regulators saying, people like this. This is safe. This is a popular service. Do you really want to ban a popular service based on spurious reasons? And ultimately, Uber won. And I'm like, well, what if Cruise were just like, yes, thank you, California. We're just going to keep operating anyway. And you can fine us if you like and see how things go, right? Like, why not copy that Uber playbook?
So there was one thing about the Uber playbook that was underappreciated by most, but the people who understood what we were doing really got it. When we launched in a city where we weren't welcomed, let's say, we launched fast and hard, and we made sure people were reliant on Uber to get to the airport for date night. And so by the time the regulators were like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on, we had so many fans in that city that they demanded their politicians sort of step back. And it was the ability to create such a useful service very quickly for so many people. And since it was capital light, all we did is sign up drivers and riders, right? It wasn't about like deploying a $70,000 car, which even Google can't do at mass. The sort of political dynamics were different. I think one other interesting angle here might be like, you know, in China or India, they're building some new city and they design it primarily for driverless cars. And you have an example of something working in a systematic way that might then show the rest of the world that, hey, wait a minute, holy cow, this works. These cars all talk to each other. There's less accidents. There's less traffic. There's less, you know, all the things. But I don't think the Uber tactics work with this kind of thing because of the capital heavy thing.
That's actually a really good point.
Not enough people love it.
I mean, I don't know. You're like, yeah, you're right about the capital heavy thing, but maybe Waymo, what they could do is they could go to a tier 2, tier 3 city, population of about 1 million people, and they could afford to just blanket that thing in Waymos. but they're not doing that, right? They're expanding very cautiously.
Well, what's interesting is you have this odd political dynamic where the blue states, which are typically regulatory heavy, Arizona and California, are actually allowing the driverless cars to have this back and forth thing. But the red states, which usually are regulation light, are like, no. This is a labor thing. We don't want people to lose their jobs. We don't want fake meat. We don't want all this stuff. So it's sort of just an odd dynamic. You're like, where do you go?
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, Tesla is an interesting one, right? And I wanted to come back to them because you mentioned Elon being brazen, but also you mentioned the capital light Uber model. Now, the only sort of AV company that can replicate that is Tesla because, again, they don't own the vehicles. Someone else owns the vehicles and they can create a service out of them. So it's interesting to me that, what I've seen out of Elon Musk and Tesla for the last few years is a lot of bluster, but they actually haven't done anything super bold in the space. Like, why haven't they launched a Robotaxi service in the Bay Area? Plenty of Teslas around, that's for sure.
Well, coming August 9th, there's a big announcement from Tesla on Robotaxi, so we'll see what that,
okay, we'll see.
That says.